Hello guys and welcome back. Today we will be painting this German soldier. I got the files from Germania Figuren and 3D printed them myself. If you want to know more about how I do my printing, let me know in the comments, I might do a separate video for that. I already cleaned the figure from all its supports. Now I am carefully drilling a hole into one of his shoes to attach a piece of wire. This allows me to mount the figure on a cork, giving me a very inexpensive handle. As a first step, I primed the figure with a black spray primer. This is always recommended, especially for resin parts, to ensure that the subsequent layers of paint adhere more reliably. This medium brown shade forms the base for the uniform. To ensure the color is nice and even, while keeping the details clearly visible, I use an airbrush for this step as well, coating the figure from top to bottom. This figure represents a WSS soldier wearing a camouflage smock. This was a reversible garment featuring two different patterns, one for the spring and summer and the other for the autumn and winter. I opted for the spring version here. Next comes a slightly lighter shade of brown, which I spray from above. With this I aim to create some color variation and give the figure a more three-dimensional appearance. All colors for the uniform come from the same AK Interactive set. I really like these sets because they include multiple shades for the base uniform as well as all the tones needed for the camouflage patterns. And then there is a darker shade of brown intended for the shadows. I am spraying that one from below now. To be honest, I think the effect will be less visible in the end than I initially thought, so I might make the contrast a bit more pronounced next time. Here is the figure now that it is dry. And yes, it still looks somewhat monochromatic, even though I used 3 different shades. But that's no big deal, we can touch it up a bit right at the end. I'm starting with the face now. First of all, I'm no expert when it comes to faces, and I still have plenty of techniques to try out and refine. But I found a technique that I think I quite like. For the skin, I also use a paint set from AK. I start with this darker tone, applying it to the face and hands in several thin layers. The goal is an even base coat. I need to let this dry completely now. Next, I use one of the new contrast colors from AK, a sort of thick acrylic wash. I spread this all over the face and hands, allowing it to pool in the recesses and around the details. These are our deepest and darkest shadows. Basically, I work from dark to light here. This color too needs to dry completely now. Next up are the eyes. I have never done it this way before, but what could go wrong? First, I apply 2 white dots for the eyes. I am doing this at an early stage so that it is easier to adjust and correct the shape and size using skin tones later. That's also why the spots can look a bit rough for now. Next, a thin, small, dark brown line goes through the middle. That becomes our pupil. He looks a bit funny now, but we will correct that now. I am using the same shade I used for the base layer again. Since the wash darkened the entire face, this color helps to brighten things back up a bit. It also allows me to correct and refine the shape of the eyes. I will now gradually lighten all the areas of the face that protrude and are not in shadow. To do this, I gradually use the 2 lighter skin tones from the set. I also mix the colors with an ultra matte clear coat, a technique I learned from Calvin Tan's tutorials. This turns the colors into something like a glaze, making them easier to blend. Each time I mix and apply a lighter shade, I reduce the size of the area in question. There are some good guides on which areas should end up being the lightest, primarily the nose, chin and cheekbones. That is also one of the reasons why having a well-sculpted, detailed figure is so important, especially for beginners like me. The better the face is sculpted, the easier it is to follow the contours and bring them out. Consequently, a 50-year-old Tamiya figure is significantly more difficult to paint than a brand new resin figure. That is unfortunately a challenge when it comes to figures, because it certainly isn't easy for a beginner to buy an expensive resin figure right away without any prior experience. That is why I'm so glad that I can now print my own figures properly. It makes each individual figure much more affordable to practice with. As said in the beginning, if you want to see how I print my figures, tell me in the comments, I will gladly make a tutorial for that. Now I dilute a red contrast paint a bit further and apply it as a very thin glaze to the cheeks and lips to add more color and life to the face. But just very lightly, we don't want bright red cheeks. And then the final lightest skin tone for the final highlights. The whole process can certainly be summed up as just the process. But I think the result is a pretty decent face, one that definitely looks good enough from an arm's length. That means the uniform and equipment are next. I will pick out and paint a few details at this stage. That way I will have a better idea later of where the camouflage patterns need to go and where they don't. I'm painting these leather straps a very dark brown, almost black. The same applies to the pouches on his belt. That is a bit more difficult since the figure is made in a single piece, but it's not impossible. I will paint the pouch on the back in khaki. I'm using the same color for the gas cylinder container strap. I will likely have to touch up a few spots later, but this gives me a good overall impression of the various shades. The gas mask container is made of metal but painted field grey. That is why I am using field grey as a base color and applying the metal effects only at the very end. For the shoes, I use leather brown for the shoe itself, and once again field grey for the fabric section above the shoe. Now we come to the really interesting part, the camouflage pattern. As previously mentioned, I opted for the spring-summer version, since this figure is intended for a diorama set in France. There are 3 different pattern variants for this type of camouflage jacket. Oak leaf, the most common, palm tree and plane tree. Here I will focus primarily on the plane tree pattern. To do this, I start with larger, irregular, medium green patches. These should vary in size and be distributed fairly evenly, though there can be areas where the brown is more visible. The important thing is that the edges have to be very irregular. This can be excellently rendered by stippling the brush. I can also keep painting small dots in between the larger patches. The box shows a few examples of the 3 variants, though it is always worth having some additional reference material on hand. The steel helmets of these SS units were covered with camouflage fabric. You can easily tell whether the helmet is supposed to have camouflage or not by the slight folds along the rim. That is why I will also paint the uniform pattern here. The trousers are also in camouflage. I can't make out the exact model, but there were certainly situations without camo trousers, but the pattern fits better here anyway. Next, I need the light green from the set and a much more finer brush. Now I need to carefully fill in the previously green painted patches with the lighter green. It is very important to leave a fine border visible, so using a finer brush is key here. Here too I use a stippling motion with the brush, so that small specks of medium green remain visible within the larger patches. This step might look very labor intensive, but it's actually incredibly relaxing. We have already defined all the areas we need to work on, so it is simply a matter of filling them in without having to think too much. I am also really happy with the high opacity of the AK 3rd Gen paints here. I had some trouble with coverage when using the ammo paints for the P-dot pattern, but that wasn't an issue here. All of the colors cover beautifully with just one or sometimes two coats, which definitely saves a lot of work. I'm also painting small dots into the very small spots. The uniform is slowly starting to take shape. Now I just need the last color from the set, the very dark green. I'll use this to add irregular dark patches over the entire uniform. Small dots that break up the previous patches, and also appear directly on the brown areas. Even reference material will reach their limits here, depending on the image quality, because the medium green and the dark green look very similar even in the original. Nevertheless, these patches are important for the overall look, as they, among other things, help break up the light green patches a bit. In some reference images, they were just dots, while in others, they were small irregular spots. So I decided to simply do both of them for more variety. This type of camouflage jacket features very prominent crossed cords beneath the collar. To make them stand out more, I am now carefully painting them khaki. I intentionally left the collar uncamouflaged because, judging by reference photos, the jacket itself appears to have no collar. It is therefore likely the underlying uniform showing through, which would simply be field grey. I want to try out a new technique for the rifle here. First, I need to carefully prime it using Vallejo's old wood. I have to be very careful around the fingers and sleeves, so I don't paint over the work I have already done. In hindsight, I should have painted the rifle beforehand. The metal parts of the rifle are painted in Ammo's gunmetal. I'd like to make one final small adjustment to the back. Based on some reference material, these sections of the straps were likely a slightly lighter shade of leather. I'm also going to further highlight the straps on the pouch, simply to add a bit more variation. Small details like that can make a really big difference on the overall look. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to add metallic effects to the gas mask container. To do this, I need a tiny piece of sponge and some metallic aluminium paint to apply a very light chipping to the container. But I have to be careful not to accidentally chip the uniform. Now a coat of satin clear varnish is applied over the entire figure. This allows me to protect all the work done so far from the upcoming enamel effects. To create the wood grain on the rifle, I let some brown oil paint dry out for a few hours. Now I take a small amount and carefully apply it using an old, worn-out, stiff brush. I move the brush in the direction of the barrel to produce a very fine wood grain effect. However, using the brush is tricky, especially around the hands. A toothpick helps here, allowing me to push the paint right up against the hand. By carefully scratching the toothpick across the surface, I can create additional texture. Next up is a wash for the uniform. To do this, I first apply a thin layer of white spirit to the figure. This helps the wash flow better and prevent it from drying too quickly, given that temperatures here are currently reaching nearly 40 degrees Celsius. For the wash, I opted for a ready-made dark brown mixture. My goal is to further accentuate the existing details and folds. A general drawback of this uniform is that even in the original it features very little surface detail, so we have to make the most of what is here. Since I apply the wash as a so-called global wash, it also acts as a filter that helps blend the colors together better. However, it makes it absolutely crucial that the wash is under no circumstances applied to the face. Doing so would instantly ruin all the work we have done previously. Precision is therefore required, especially on the helmet, where I want to accentuate the subtle folds of the camouflage cover. I have one more effect for the shoes. I apply this dust wash to the very bottom of the soles and carefully blend it upwards. After all, shoes are usually in contact with the ground, so it is perfectly fine to make them look a bit dirty. The specific shade will of course depend on your plans for a diorama, if one is intended. And finally, the entire soldier gets a coat of ultra matte clear varnish to seal everything and eliminate the remaining shine. And with that, this mini project is finished. Another figure completed and one step closer to getting better at painting figures. I have printed a whole bunch of them, so if you'd like to see the other two camouflage patterns or the autumn and winter camo, feel free to let me know. This naturally applies to any other types of uniforms you might want to see, whether German or Allied, old or modern. However, I'm very happy with this figure, considering my skill level, and I hope there were a few interesting techniques or tips in there for you, or that you simply enjoyed watching me grapple with one of the more complex camouflage patterns. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to never miss any future uploads. Any feedback or suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and see you next time.